The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling estate of Winston Blackwell, one of the wealthiest horse breeders in Kentucky. Rows of luxury cars lined the winding driveway leading to the immaculate white mansion where the annual Blackwell Thoroughbred auction was taking place. Men in tailored suits and women draped in designer dresses mingled on the manicured lawn, champagne flutes glinting in the afternoon light. Among them stood Thomas Abernathy, an elderly man whose weathered face and simple attire set him apart from the sea of opulence surrounding him. Thomas adjusted his worn tweed jacket and straightened his back, wincing slightly at the familiar pain that had become his constant companion over the years. At 78, he was well past his prime, but his eyes remained sharp, missing nothing as they scanned the crowd of elite buyers and their entourages. He wasn't supposed to be here. People like him, retired horse trainers with modest savings, weren't typically invited to events where single horses sold for millions. But Thomas had received an anonymous envelope containing an invitation and a note that simply read, "The third horse. You'll know." The mysterious message had pulled him from his quiet life on his small Kentucky farm, drawing him back into a world he'd left behind decades ago. He took a deep breath and made his way toward the viewing paddocks where prospective buyers examined the thoroughbreds before the auction began. "Excuse me, sir, but this area is for registered bidders only," a young attendant said, blocking Thomas's path with a polite but firm tone. Thomas reached into his pocket and produced the embossed invitation card. "I believe this will suffice," he said quietly. The attendant examined the card, his eyebrows rising slightly. "My apologies, Mr. Abernathy. Please, go right ahead." Thomas nodded and continued toward the paddocks, aware of the curious glances from the wealthy patrons. He could almost hear their thoughts. Who is this old man? What is he doing here? Does he actually think he can afford these horses? At the first paddock, a magnificent black stallion pranced proudly, muscles rippling beneath a gleaming coat. Potential buyers crowded around, exclaiming over the animal's perfect proportions and impressive lineage. The second paddock held a chestnut mare with long, elegant legs and a prestigious racing history. Again, the wealthy patrons clustered eagerly, checkbooks practically visible in their eagerness. But the third paddock stood nearly empty. Thomas approached slowly, his heart suddenly pounding with unexpected force. Inside was a bay gelding, not as striking as the others at first glance. The horse stood quietly, head lowered, almost as if trying to disappear. Unlike the other thoroughbreds who seemed to understand their value and preened accordingly, this one appeared resigned, defeated somehow. "No one's much interested in that one," a stable hand commented, noticing Thomas's attention. "Name's Windcatcher. Good bloodlines, but he hasn't performed well in trials. Probably end up sold to some riding school if anyone bothers to bid at all." Thomas approached the fence, and the horse raised its head, ears pricking forward. Their eyes met, and a jolt of recognition passed through Thomas so powerfully that he had to grab the fence for support. "Are you all right, sir?" the stable hand asked, reaching out to steady him. "Fine, fine," Thomas muttered, unable to look away from the horse. "May I enter the paddock?" The stable hand hesitated. "Well, it's not standard procedure, but since no one else is showing interest, just be careful. He can be temperamental." Thomas slipped through the gate and approached the gelding slowly. "Hello, old friend," he whispered, extending his hand. The horse sniffed his palm, then nudged it gently. Thomas ran his fingers along the animal's neck, feeling the strong muscles beneath the coat. As he did, his fingers encountered something unusual, a small, almost imperceptible scar just below the mane. His breath caught. It couldn't be. "Excuse me," a sharp voice interrupted. "What do you think you're doing?" Thomas turned to find a tall, impeccably dressed man glaring at him. Bradford Blackwell, Winston's son and the current head of Blackwell Thoroughbreds, was known for his cold business acumen and ruthless pursuit of profit. "Just examining the horse," Thomas replied calmly, though his heart raced with mounting suspicion. "Are you a registered bidder?" Bradford demanded. Thomas produced his invitation again. "I am." Bradford's eyes narrowed as he read the name. "Abernathy? Thomas Abernathy? The trainer? Former trainer, Thomas corrected gently. I don't recall approving your invitation, Bradford said, his voice tight with poorly concealed irritation. Perhaps your father extended the courtesy, Thomas suggested. A flash of anger crossed Bradford's face at the mention of his father. Winston Blackwell had suffered a stroke 2 years earlier and now resided in the east wing of the mansion, largely removed from the family business. My father is no longer involved in these matters, he said coldly. Nevertheless, since you're here, feel free to examine the merchandise. Though I doubt this particular specimen would be within your price range, modest as it may be. With that, Bradford strode away, immediately surrounded by assistants vying for his attention. Thomas turned back to the horse, his mind racing. He gently lifted the animal's mane again, examining the scar more carefully. Then he checked the inside of the left ear, finding exactly what he feared he would: a small white mark in the shape of a crescent moon. It is you, he whispered, his voice breaking. Spirit. The horse nickered softly in response, as if recognizing not just the man, but the name that had not been spoken in almost 7 years. Thomas leaned his forehead against the horse's neck, memories flooding back with painful clarity. Spirit had been his greatest achievement, a horse he had raised from birth and trained personally. With unmatched speed and heart, Spirit had been destined for greatness, until that fateful race when everything had gone wrong. They had told Thomas that Spirit had been euthanized due to his injuries. They had shown him documentation, offered condolences, even given him a commemorative plaque. It had all been a lie. Ladies and gentlemen, a voice announced over the loudspeaker, please make your way to the auction pavilion. The Blackwell Annual Thoroughbred Auction will commence in 15 minutes. Thomas straightened, resolve hardening his features. He didn't know how Spirit had ended up here, renamed and disguised as an underperforming gelding, but he intended to find out. More importantly, he intended to bring his horse home. The problem was, Thomas had exactly $27,000 to his name, his entire life savings. At an auction where horses routinely sold for hundreds of thousands or even millions, it was a pittance. But as he gave Spirit one last pat and headed toward the auction pavilion, Thomas knew he would bid every cent if that's what it took. What he didn't know was just how deep the deception ran, or how dangerous his discovery would prove to be. The auction pavilion was a marvel of modern architecture, all glass and steel, yet somehow managing to evoke the traditional grandeur of Kentucky horse country. Tiered seating surrounded the central showing area where each horse would be paraded before the eager bidders. Thomas found a seat in the back row, away from the clusters of wealthy buyers who occupied the premium sections. From his vantage point, he could observe everyone without drawing attention to himself. The first 2 horses fetched astronomical sums, as expected. The Black Stallion went for $1.2 million to a Saudi prince's representative, while the chestnut mare was purchased by a famous Hollywood actress for just under $1 million. Throughout it all, Thomas sat motionless, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap, waiting. Next up, lot number 3, the auctioneer announced with noticeably less enthusiasm. Windcatcher, bay gelding, 5 years old. As the handlers led Spirit into the center, Thomas felt a painful constriction in his chest. The horse moved with subdued grace, a mere shadow of the magnificent athlete he had once been. Yet Thomas could still see glimpses of that former glory in the way the animal held his head, in the perfect proportions of his body. Windcatcher comes from respectable bloodlines but has shown inconsistent performance in trials, the auctioneer continued, his tone suggesting this was a mere formality. We'll start the bidding at $50,000. The pavilion remained silent. Potential buyers glanced at their catalogs, then looked away, already anticipating the next more promising lot. Bradford Blackwell, seated in the front row, shifted uncomfortably, shooting a pointed look at the auctioneer. $40,000 then, the auctioneer amended, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. Surely this fine animal is worth $40,000. More silence. Someone coughed. A woman whispered to her companion. Thomas saw Bradford's shoulders tense with what appeared to be anger or perhaps embarrassment. 30,000. The auctioneer tried again. We're practically giving him away at 30,000, ladies and gentlemen. Thomas raised his hand. 30,000, he called, his voice stronger than he expected. All heads turned toward the back of the pavilion. Bradford spun around in his seat, his eyes narrowing when he spotted Thomas. We have 30,000 from the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer said, relief evident in his voice. Do I hear 35? No one moved. The wealthy patron seemed almost bemused by the old man's bid, as if he'd purchased something quaint but worthless. Going once, going twice, 50,000, a voice interrupted sharply. Thomas turned to see a man in a charcoal suit several rows ahead. He didn't recognize him, but the man's rigid posture and the way he avoided looking directly at Bradford suggested some connection to the Blackwell family. Thomas hesitated only briefly. 60,000, he countered, mentally calculating how he would secure a loan for the difference. The man in the charcoal suit conferred briefly with someone on a phone, then nodded. 75,000. A murmur ran through the crowd. What had been a lackluster auction was suddenly becoming interesting. Bradford Blackwell had half risen from his seat, his attention fixed on the mystery bidder. Thomas felt sweat beading on his forehead. He was already committing to more than twice his savings. 80,000, he said, his voice wavering slightly. 100,000, the man in the suit responded immediately. The pavilion had gone completely silent now. All eyes darted between Thomas and the mysterious counterbidder. Even the horse seemed to sense something significant was happening, his ears pricked forward, eyes alert. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. What he was about to do was financial suicide. 120,000, he called out, his voice echoing in the hushed space. The man in the charcoal suit hesitated, then touched his ear as if listening to an earpiece. His face remained impassive as he shook his head slightly and remained silent. 120,000 going once, the auctioneer said, unable to conceal his astonishment. Going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back. A smattering of applause broke out, more out of relief that the awkward lot had been dispensed with than any real appreciation. Thomas barely heard it. His mind was racing, calculating how he would manage this financial burden, even as his heart soared at the prospect of bringing Spirit home. As he made his way to the administration office to complete the paperwork, Thomas noticed Bradford Blackwell engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument with the man in the charcoal suit. Their voices were low, but their body language spoke volumes. Bradford jabbed a finger into the man's chest, his face contorted with barely controlled rage. Mr. Abernathy, a young woman approached, clipboard in hand. If you'll follow me, we'll get your purchase processed. In a small office away from the main pavilion, Thomas sat across from a financial administrator who regarded him with barely concealed skepticism. The total comes to $126,000 including fees, she said, sliding a form across the desk. How will you be paying today? Thomas cleared his throat. I can provide $27,000 in certified funds today. For the remainder, I'll need to arrange financing. The administrator's expression shifted from skepticism to pity. I'm afraid that's not how it works, Mr. Abernathy. Full payment is due upon purchase. If you can't provide the funds, the lot will be reauctioned, and you'll be charged the difference if it sells for less. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. In his determination to save Spirit, he had overlooked this crucial detail. Perhaps I can be of assistance, a voice said from the doorway. Thomas turned to find an elegant older woman standing there, her silver hair swept into a perfect chignon, her posture as straight as a young equestrian's despite her advanced years. Mrs. Blackwell, the administrator said, half rising from her seat, I didn't realize you would be attending today. Evidently my son didn't either, the woman replied dryly. She extended a hand to Thomas. Eleanor Blackwell, you must be Thomas Abernathy. Thomas stood and shook her hand, confused by this unexpected development. I am. I've been following the auction from the house, Eleanor continued. My nurse is quite adept with the live stream technology. When I saw you bid on that particular horse, I knew I had to intervene. She turned to the administrator. Please charge the full amount to my personal account. Mr. Abernathy and I have an arrangement. The administrator looked between them, clearly baffled but unwilling to question Winston Blackwell's wife. Of course, Mrs. Blackwell. I'll process that right away. Now, Eleanor said, turning back to Thomas, I believe we have much to discuss. Would you join me for tea in the main house once you've arranged for your horse's transportation? Thomas studied her face, searching for some clue to her motives. Her expression revealed nothing except perhaps a hint of weariness around her eyes. I'd be honored, he replied cautiously. Eleanor nodded once, then departed as regally as she had arrived, leaving Thomas to wonder what exactly he had stumbled into. One thing was certain, the mystery surrounding Spirit had just deepened considerably. After arranging for Spirit's transportation to his modest farm, Thomas followed a stone path that wound through immaculate gardens toward the Blackwell mansion. The stately home loomed against the late afternoon sky, its white columns and sprawling wings a testament to generations of wealth accumulated through the horse business. As he approached the front entrance, Thomas couldn't help but recall the last time he'd been here, over 7 years ago, when Winston Blackwell had personally hired him to train what was then considered the most promising colt in their stables. A butler greeted him at the door with formal courtesy, leading him through a grand foyer adorned with equestrian artwork and trophies. Thomas felt acutely out of place, his weathered boots leaving faint traces of dust on the polished marble floors. The butler led him to a sunroom at the rear of the house where Eleanor Blackwell sat waiting, afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the estate's private racetrack. Mr. Abernathy, she said, gesturing to a chair across from her. Please, join me. Thomas nodded, taking the offered seat. A maid appeared silently, serving tea in delicate porcelain cups before disappearing again. I imagine you have questions, Eleanor began, stirring a small spoonful of sugar into her tea. Several, Thomas admitted, beginning with why you paid for a horse that I impulsively bid on without the means to follow through. Eleanor's lips curved into a slight smile. Impulsive? I think not. You knew exactly what you were doing when you bid on that particular horse. She set her spoon down with a gentle clink, just as I knew exactly why I needed to intervene. Thomas's hand paused halfway to his teacup. You recognized him too. Spirit, she confirmed softly. Winston's greatest disappointment and his most closely guarded secret. Thomas leaned forward, his tea forgotten. They told me he'd been euthanized after the accident. I was shown paperwork, given his halter as a memento. I mourned that horse for years. The paperwork was falsified, Eleanor said, her voice tinged with bitterness. A decision made not by my husband, but by our son Bradford while Winston was away on business. By the time Winston returned, the deception was complete. The horse you knew as Spirit had officially ceased to exist. But why? Thomas asked, struggling to understand. Spirit was exceptional. With proper rehabilitation, he could have recovered fully. Even if he couldn't race again, his breeding value alone. Precisely the problem, Eleanor interrupted. Bradford never believed in Spirit the way Winston did. He saw the accident as an opportunity to replace him with another bloodline, one that Bradford had personally selected against Winston's judgment. She paused, taking a small sip of tea. My son has always been impatient with his father's more sentimental approach to horse breeding. Thomas processed this information slowly. So instead of euthanizing him as they claimed, they kept him hidden, renamed him, and essentially erased his history. He shook his head in disbelief. But to include him in a public auction? That seems unnecessarily risky. Eleanor's expression darkened. Bradford assumed no one would recognize the horse after so many years. And he was correct, for the most part. The racing world has a short memory, and those who might have known Spirit personally were kept away from this particular horse. She fixed Thomas with a penetrating gaze. Except you. Someone made sure you received an invitation to today's auction, along with a hint about which horse to watch for. Thomas frowned. It wasn't you. No, though I wish I'd thought of it. I believe it was one of the stable hands, a young man named Miguel who has worked with our family for years. He was deeply attached to Spirit and was heartbroken by Bradford's treatment of the horse. And your husband? Does Winston know what happened? A shadow passed over Eleanor's face. My husband suffered a severe stroke 2 years ago. His mind is still sharp, but his body has betrayed him. Bradford has taken advantage of Winston's condition to assume control of the business, making decisions that Winston would never have approved. She set her teacup down with finality. Which brings us to why I intervened today. I want you to take Spirit home, rehabilitate him, and help me prove to the racing authorities what Bradford has done. Thomas sat back, stunned by the magnitude of what she was proposing. Mrs. Blackwell, with all due respect, this could destroy your family's reputation. The falsification of documentation alone could result in severe penalties from the Racing Commission. I'm well aware, she replied calmly, but the Blackwell name should stand for integrity, not deception. Winston built this business on his love for horses and his commitment to excellence. What Bradford has done, not just with Spirit but with numerous other decisions, threatens to unravel everything my husband worked for. Thomas studied the elderly woman before him. Despite her fragile appearance, there was steel in her gaze. Why me? He asked finally. Surely there are younger trainers with more current connections in the racing world. Because you loved that horse as much as Winston did, she said simply, and because your reputation for honesty is unimpeachable. When you speak, people in the industry listen, even after all these years. Thomas ran a hand through his thinning hair, weighing the implications. Taking on the Blackwell empire, or at least Bradford's portion of it, would be no small undertaking. At his age, he had hoped for a quiet retirement, not a public battle against one of the most powerful families in Kentucky horse racing. There's something else you should know, Eleanor continued, her voice dropping. Winston is dying. The doctors give him perhaps 6 months. Bradford knows this, which is why he's accelerating his changes to the business. Once Winston is gone, I fear there will be nothing to stop my son from completely dismantling everything my husband built. A heavy silence fell between them. Outside, the sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the manicured grounds. I'll need to think about this, Thomas said finally. Eleanor nodded. Of course, but don't take too long. Bradford will be furious when he discovers my involvement in today's auction. He'll try to find some way to invalidate the sale. As if summoned by his mother's words, the sunroom door burst open, and Bradford Blackwell strode in, his face flushed with anger. What the hell do you think you're doing? He demanded, glaring at his mother before turning his fury on Thomas. And you had no right to bid on that horse. No right at all. Eleanor remained perfectly composed. I believe Mr. Abernathy had every right, as a registered bidder with a valid invitation, and the sale is complete. The horse now belongs to him. Bradford's eyes narrowed dangerously. An invitation he should never have received, and a sale facilitated with your money, without my authorization. I don't require your authorization to spend my own money, Bradford, Eleanor replied coolly. Your father made quite sure of that in our prenuptial agreement. Bradford's jaw worked as he struggled to contain his rage. Finally, he pointed a trembling finger at Thomas. This isn't over, Abernathy. That horse was never meant to leave these grounds. There are things you don't understand. I understand more than you think, Thomas replied quietly. Spirit deserved better than to be erased and forgotten. Bradford's face went white. Get out, he hissed. Get off my property now, or I'll have security remove you. Thomas rose slowly, his old knees protesting the movement. The transport for the horse has been arranged. I'll be leaving shortly. See that you do, Bradford snapped, then turned to his mother. We'll discuss this later. Eleanor merely raised an eyebrow, unintimidated by her son's display. As Bradford stormed out of the room, she turned back to Thomas. You see what we're dealing with, she said softly. Bradford has always valued profit over the horses themselves. It's only gotten worse since he gained control. Thomas nodded, his decision crystallizing. I'll help you, Mrs. Blackwell, for Spirit's sake and for your husband's legacy. Relief washed over Eleanor's face. Thank you, Thomas. I'll be in touch with the documentation you'll need. She reached into a drawer of the side table and withdrew a small, leather-bound notebook. This was Winston's private breeding journal. He recorded everything about Spirit in here, his training, his potential, his unique qualities. Bradford doesn't know it exists. It may help you with the rehabilitation. Thomas accepted the notebook reverently, understanding its value. I'll guard it with my life. As he left the Blackwell estate with Spirit loaded safely in a transport trailer, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he had just entered a dangerous game. Bradford's threats echoed in his mind, mingling with Eleanor's revelations and the undeniable joy of reuniting with a horse he had thought long dead. Whatever came next, there was no turning back. The drive back to Thomas's farm took just over an hour, but it felt much longer. Every few minutes he glanced in his rearview mirror at the horse trailer behind him, still unable to believe that Spirit was inside. The weight of Winston's journal pressed against his chest from the inside pocket of his jacket, a physical reminder of the commitment he had just made to Eleanor Blackwell. As he turned onto the gravel road leading to his modest property, Thomas felt a mix of emotions. His farm was nothing like the Blackwell estate, just 40 acres with a small weathered house, a 6-stall barn that had seen better days, and a few paddocks surrounded by oak rail fencing. It was humble, but it was paid for, the culmination of a lifetime working with horses. The sun had nearly set by the time he parked in front of the barn. His neighbor, Charlie Wilson, emerged from inside, wiping his hands on a rag. Charlie was 15 years Thomas's junior, but had already retired from his job as the local veterinarian. Now he helped Thomas with the few horses he kept as a hobby. "So you actually went through with it," Charlie said, eyeing the trailer. "When you told me you were going to that fancy auction, I thought you were just curious to see how the other half lives." Thomas managed a tired smile. Things got complicated. Charlie raised an eyebrow. "They usually do when you're involved, Tom. What did you bring home? Some broken-down nag they couldn't sell?" "Not exactly." Thomas moved to the back of the trailer and began unfastening the door. "Remember that horse I trained years back? The one that was supposed to be the next Triple Crown winner?" Charlie's expression shifted from amusement to disbelief. "Spirit? Tom, that horse died. You went to the memorial service the Blackwells held. Hell, you gave a speech about him." "Apparently, reports of his death were greatly exaggerated," Thomas replied, swinging the trailer door open. Inside, Spirit stood quietly, his ears pricked forward at the sound of their voices. The horse looked tired from the journey, but his eyes were alert, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Charlie stared, his mouth slightly open. "Son of a bitch," he whispered. "It is him. But how? Why?" "That's a long story," Thomas said, climbing into the trailer and gently attaching a lead rope to Spirit's halter. "One that involves family drama, corporate greed, and a whole lot of deception. I'll tell you everything, but first, let's get him settled." Together, they led Spirit into the barn. The horse moved cautiously, sniffing the air and scanning his new environment. Thomas had prepared the largest stall, laying fresh bedding and filling the water trough. Spirit stepped inside, turned a complete circle, then lowered his head to investigate the hay. "He's thinner than he should be," Charlie observed, professional instincts kicking in. "And that's definitely an old injury on his right hind leg. Tendon damage, if I had to guess." Thomas nodded. They were using him for mediocre breeding, probably minimal veterinary care, just enough to keep him functional. Charlie shook his head in disgust. "The Blackwells did this? I thought Winston was supposed to be one of the good ones." "Winston didn't know," Thomas explained, watching Spirit closely. "It was Bradford, his son. He fabricated the euthanasia documents after Spirit's accident. Winston was away at the time. By the time he returned, it was a done deal." "And you just happened to stumble across him at the auction today?" Thomas hesitated, then pulled the invitation from his pocket. Someone wanted me to find him. I received this anonymously a week ago. Charlie examined the embossed card. Someone inside the Blackwell operation, then. Someone who knew the truth and wanted to set it right. That's what Eleanor Blackwell thinks, too. Charlie's head snapped up. You spoke with the family? Tom, what exactly have you gotten yourself into? Thomas sighed heavily, suddenly feeling every one of his 78 years. I'm not entirely sure, but I know I couldn't leave him there, not after I realized who he was. They finished settling Spirit in for the night, making sure he had everything he needed. The horse seemed to relax as they worked, the familiar routines of barn life providing comfort after the stress of the auction and transport. Back at the house, Thomas brewed a pot of strong coffee and laid Winston's journal on the kitchen table. Charlie sat across from him, still processing everything he'd seen. Eleanor Blackwell wants me to rehabilitate Spirit, Thomas explained, pouring 2 mugs of coffee. Not just physically, but she wants to restore his identity, to expose what Bradford did. Charlie whistled low. That's a tall order, Tom. Bradford Blackwell has a lot of influence in racing circles. Going against him won't be easy. I know. Thomas opened Winston's journal, carefully turning the pages filled with meticulous notes in an elegant, slanted handwriting. But according to Eleanor, Winston is dying. He has months at most. She wants to preserve his legacy, to make sure people remember what he stood for in the industry. And what about you? What do you get out of this crusade? Thomas looked up, surprised by the question. I get Spirit back. That's more than I ever thought possible. Charlie leaned forward, concern etched on his face. Tom, you're my friend, and I care about you. But you're 78 years old. Rehabilitating a horse with serious injuries, taking on one of the most powerful families in Kentucky. That's a young man's game. Maybe, Thomas conceded. But who else is going to do it? Who else even remembers what Spirit was, what he could have been? Charlie sat back, recognizing the stubborn determination in his friend's eyes. All right, but you're not doing this alone. I'll help with his medical care at least. I appreciate that, Thomas said sincerely. He turned another page in the journal and suddenly stopped, his finger hovering over a particular entry. Charlie, look at this. Charlie moved his chair around to see. The entry was dated a week before Spirit's career-ending accident. Winston had written about a conversation with a jockey who had expressed concerns about tampering with the horse's equipment. The jockey had noticed something odd about the saddle used in training, but couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong. He suspected someone was setting Spirit up to fail, Thomas said quietly. Or worse, to be injured. Charlie read further down the page, and Winston dismissed it as paranoia. He trusted the people around him, Thomas murmured. As did I. They continued reading, finding more entries that, in retrospect, painted a disturbing picture. Winston had noted changes in Spirit's behavior before the accident, moments of uncharacteristic nervousness that he had attributed to the pressure of training for major races. There were also mentions of disagreements with Bradford about the direction of the breeding program, with Bradford pushing to acquire bloodlines from overseas at enormous expense. Follow the money, Charlie said grimly. If Spirit had succeeded the way Winston expected, Bradford wouldn't have been able to justify his foreign acquisitions. Thomas nodded slowly. So he made sure Spirit wouldn't succeed. A cold weight settled in Thomas's stomach as the implications became clear. Bradford hadn't just covered up Spirit's survival after the accident. He might have orchestrated the accident itself. This is bigger than just falsified documents, Thomas said. If Bradford deliberately caused that accident, it goes beyond racing violations. It's criminal. Charlie rubbed his face wearily. That's a serious accusation, Tom. You'd need solid proof, not just suspicions jotted in a journal. The proof might be in Spirit himself, Thomas replied, his mind racing. If we can document his identity conclusively, DNA testing, identifying marks, the works, then we can prove the deception. From there, We might be able to build a case about the accident. It won't be easy, Charlie warned, and Bradford won't take this lying down. If he went to these lengths to hide what he did, he won't hesitate to protect himself now. As if in response to Charlie's words, Thomas's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway. "Mr. Abernathy?" a young male voice said, speaking barely above a whisper. "This is Miguel Sanchez. I work at the Blackwell stables." "Miguel," Thomas repeated, catching Charlie's eye. "Eleanor mentioned you." "I don't have much time," Miguel continued urgently. "Mr. Bradford is furious about what happened today. He's already fired 2 security guards who let you onto the property. He's asking questions, trying to find out who sent you the invitation." Thomas's grip tightened on the phone. "Are you in danger, son?" "Maybe. I don't know. But that's not why I'm calling. There's something you need to know about Spirit. Something important." Miguel's voice dropped even lower. "There's a microchip. Not the standard registration one, but a special one Mr. Bradford had implanted. I think it's some kind of tracking device." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying Bradford can track Spirit's location?" "I'm not sure, but it's possible. He has all kinds of technology the rest of us don't understand. Just be careful, Mr. Abernathy. Mr. Bradford isn't going to let this go." The call ended abruptly, leaving Thomas staring at the phone in dismay. "What is it?" Charlie asked, alarmed by his friend's expression. "We need to check Spirit for a tracking device," Thomas said, already rising from his chair. "And then we need to decide just how far we're willing to go in this fight, because it seems Bradford Blackwell is ready to go all the way." Dawn broke with a gentle mist hovering over the paddocks of Thomas's farm. He had barely slept, spending most of the night in the barn with Spirit, alternating between reading Winston's journal by lamplight and simply watching the horse he had thought lost forever. Charlie had returned just after sunrise with his old veterinary equipment, determined to locate the tracking device Miguel had warned them about. "I've brought a universal scanner," Charlie explained, setting a metal case on the bench outside Spirit's stall. "It should detect any standard microchip frequency, including the specialized ones." Thomas led Spirit into the barn aisle, where the light was better. The horse seemed more settled this morning, his eyes clearer, his movements more fluid. He stood patiently as Charlie ran the scanner over his neck, the standard location for identification microchips in horses. "Got the regular one," Charlie confirmed, checking the readout. "Registration number matches what would have been assigned to Spirit back then." "So they kept his original chip?" Thomas asked, surprised. "Makes sense if they wanted to maintain breeding records without raising questions. A missing microchip would be suspicious." Charlie continued moving the scanner methodically across different parts of the horse's body. When he reached the base of Spirit's right ear, the device emitted a different tone. "There's something here," Charlie said, frowning. "Different frequency than the standard chip." He examined the area more closely, feeling with his fingertips. "There's a small scar, almost invisible unless you know what you're looking for. This was implanted after the main chip, and it's not veterinary standard." Thomas felt a surge of anger at the thought of Bradford using Spirit like some sort of package to be tracked. "Can you remove it?" Charlie's frown deepened. "I could, but that might alert Bradford that we're onto him. These advanced tracking chips often have tamper alerts." "So what do we do?" Thomas asked, stroking Spirit's neck to keep him calm during the examination. "For now, we leave it," Charlie decided. "But we'll need to be strategic about when and how we move Spirit. If Bradford is tracking him, we don't want to tip our hand too early." They returned Spirit to his stall and moved to the small office attached to the barn, where Thomas kept his breeding records and training notes. Charlie spread a detailed map of the county across the desk. "We need a safe place," he said, tapping areas on the map. "Somewhere we can take Spirit where Bradford won't have easy access, but where we can still continue the rehabilitation and documentation." Thomas considered the options. "What about Jessie Morgan's place? She's got that training facility up in the hills, very private. Good security since she works with those expensive European dressage horses." Charlie nodded thoughtfully. "Jessie's good people. She respected you a lot back when you were actively training. But are you sure she'd be willing to get involved in something this risky? Only one way to find out, Thomas replied, reaching for his phone. Before he could dial, however, the sound of a vehicle on the gravel driveway caught their attention. Through the small office window, they saw a sleek black SUV pull up, followed by a police cruiser. That didn't take long, Charlie muttered. Thomas straightened his shoulders and walked out to meet the visitors, Charlie following close behind. From the SUV emerged a sharply dressed woman in her 40s, carrying a leather portfolio. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Bill Taggart, approached from the cruiser. "Mr. Abernathy," the woman greeted him with professional coolness. "I'm Diane Harper, legal counsel for Blackwell Thoroughbreds. I believe you have property belonging to my client." Thomas regarded her steadily. "If you're referring to the horse I purchased legally at yesterday's auction, then yes, he's here." Diane Harper's smile didn't reach her eyes. "There appears to have been a significant misunderstanding. The horse in question was not actually eligible for sale. It was included in the auction catalog by administrative error." "That's convenient," Charlie interjected. The lawyer shot him a brief, dismissive glance before continuing. "Mr. Blackwell is prepared to refund the purchase price in full, with an additional compensation for your inconvenience. Sheriff Taggart is here to ensure the smooth return of the animal." Thomas crossed his arms. "The sale was completed legally. The horse is mine." "I'm afraid it's not that simple," Harper replied, opening her portfolio. "The horse has been reported stolen." "Stolen?" Thomas repeated incredulously. "I bought him at a public auction with dozens of witnesses." Sheriff Taggart stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. "Tom, I've got a report here saying the horse was taken without authorization. I don't want to make this difficult, but—" "Show me the report," Thomas demanded. The sheriff handed over a document. Thomas scanned it quickly, his anger mounting as he read Bradford Blackwell's statement claiming that the horse known as Windcatcher had been included in the auction without proper authorization, and that Thomas Abernathy had conspired with an unnamed Blackwell employee to fraudulently acquire the animal. "This is absurd," Thomas said, handing the paper back. "Sheriff, you know me. I've lived in this county my entire life. Do you honestly believe I'd steal a horse?" Taggart shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Look, Tom, I'm just doing my job. Mr. Blackwell has filed a formal complaint. I need to investigate." "Then investigate properly," Thomas insisted. "Check the auction records. Speak with the auctioneer. The sale was legitimate." "Perhaps," Diane Harper interjected smoothly. "But the offering of the horse was not. Mr. Blackwell has provided documentation showing that this particular animal was marked as not for sale in the company's internal records." Thomas felt a cold anger building inside him. And what about the documentation showing that this horse is actually Spirit, a thoroughbred supposedly euthanized 7 years ago? What about the falsified euthanasia certificates? Shall we investigate those as well? Harper's composed expression faltered momentarily. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." "I think you are," Thomas countered. "And I think Bradford Blackwell is desperate to get this horse back before anyone else recognizes him for who he truly is." The lawyer recovered quickly. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Abernathy. If you persist with such defamatory claims, Blackwell Thoroughbreds will have no choice but to pursue legal action against you personally." "Tom," Sheriff Taggart said quietly, "maybe it's best to resolve this peacefully. If they're offering a full refund plus compensation—" "This isn't about money," Thomas interrupted. "It's about right and wrong. It's about what happened to a magnificent animal that was supposed to be in my care, that I was told had been humanely euthanized after an injury. Instead, he was hidden away, renamed, and apparently mistreated for years." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Harper closed her portfolio with a sharp snap. "Mr. Abernathy, my client is prepared to be generous in this matter, but our patience is not unlimited. I strongly advise you to reconsider your position." "And I strongly advise Bradford Blackwell to drop this charade before it backfires spectacularly," Thomas replied evenly. "I have Winston Blackwell's personal journal documenting Spirit's unique characteristics and training history. I have a veterinarian," he gestured to Charlie, who can verify the horse's identity, and I believe Eleanor Blackwell herself would be very interested in testifying about her son's actions. At the mention of Eleanor, Harper's expression tightened. Mrs. Blackwell's health has been declining. She is not in a position to involve herself in business matters. Is that what Bradford is telling people? Thomas asked, because she seemed remarkably lucid when I spoke with her yesterday. Sheriff Taggart glanced between them, clearly realizing that the situation was more complex than he had been led to believe. Look, I can see there's a lot more to this than a simple ownership dispute. I'm not going to seize any animals today without a proper court order. He turned to Harper. Tell Mr. Blackwell he'll need to pursue this through proper legal channels if Mr. Abernathy isn't willing to return the horse voluntarily. Harper's lips pressed into a thin line of displeasure. Sheriff Taggart, I must remind you that my client is a prominent member of this community, and Tom Abernathy has been a respected citizen of this county for nearly 8 decades, Taggart cut in firmly. I'm not taking sides here. I'm following procedure. Recognizing defeat, at least for the moment, Harper reached into her portfolio again and withdrew a business card. When you reconsider, Mr. Abernathy, call this number. The offer remains open for 48 hours. After they departed, Thomas and Charlie returned to the barn office, both shaken by the confrontation. That won't be the end of it, Charlie warned. Bradford will escalate. Next time it won't be just a lawyer and the sheriff. He might get a court order or worse. Thomas nodded grimly, which means we need to move quickly. He picked up his phone and dialed Jesse Morgan's number. Jesse, it's Thomas Abernathy. I need your help with something delicate. As he explained the situation, leaving out the most damning details but making it clear that a horse's welfare was at stake, Thomas watched through the window as Spirit grazed peacefully in the small paddock beside the barn. The horse lifted his head occasionally, ears pricked toward the surrounding hills as if sensing something beyond human perception. We'll be ready to move him tonight, Thomas told Charlie after ending the call. Jessie's on board. She never did like Bradford much. Charlie nodded, relief evident in his expression. Good, but we'll need to be careful about the tracking chip. Bradford will know exactly where Spirit is unless we figure out how to disable or remove it. Thomas considered this problem, then smiled slowly as an idea formed. Maybe we want Bradford to know exactly where the horse is, just not which horse. Charlie raised an eyebrow questioningly. I still have connections at Churchill Downs, Thomas explained. There's a horse there with almost identical markings to Spirit, same bay coloring, same star on the forehead. What if we arranged a little switch? Move the tracking chip to the decoy horse, while the real Spirit goes to Jesse's place? Risky, Charlie admitted, but it might buy us the time we need. Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation with Bradford's lawyer had only strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about saving one horse anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of deception that had corrupted the Blackwell legacy. Make the arrangements for tonight, he told Charlie, and see if you can get hold of Eleanor Blackwell. We need to coordinate our efforts before Bradford isolates her completely. As Charlie headed out to make the necessary calls, Thomas returned to Spirit's side. The horse nickered softly at his approach, pushing his muzzle against Thomas's chest in a gesture of trust. Don't worry, old friend, Thomas murmured, stroking the strong neck. We're going to make this right, whatever it takes. Darkness had fallen by the time they were ready to move Spirit. Thomas had spent the afternoon making careful preparations, calling in favors from old friends in the racing industry. Charlie had returned with specialized equipment to safely transfer the tracking chip once they reached Churchill Downs, where an obliging trainer had agreed to provide temporary shelter for their decoy operation. The horse trailer's ready, Charlie announced, entering the barn where Thomas was giving Spirit a final check. I've covered the Blackwell Thoroughbred logo on the side with magnetic signs from my old veterinary practice. Should fool anyone who happens to see us on the road. Thomas nodded, adjusting Spirit's halter. The horse seemed to sense the tension in the air, his ears constantly moving, eyes alert but not fearful. Thomas stroked his neck reassuringly. It's going to be all right, boy. Just like the old days when we traveled to races together. They led Spirit carefully out to the waiting trailer. The night was overcast, no moon or stars visible to illuminate their activities. Thomas had turned off most of the farm lights, leaving only the bare minimum necessary to see their way safely to the vehicle. "Once we're on the main road, drive normally," Thomas instructed as Charlie took the wheel. "We don't want to attract attention by moving too cautiously." Charlie nodded, starting the engine. "If Bradford is tracking Spirit's movements, he'll know we're heading toward Louisville. Do you think he'll try to intercept us?" "It's possible," Thomas admitted, "but I'm counting on him being cautious. He won't want to make a scene on a public highway." As they pulled out onto the rural road that would eventually connect with the interstate, Thomas kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings. Every set of headlights in the rearview mirror caused a moment of tension, but none seemed to be following them with any particular interest. They were about 20 minutes into the journey when Thomas's phone rang. He checked the display. Unknown caller. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "Mr. Abernathy?" Eleanor Blackwell's refined voice came through clearly. "I've been trying to reach you all afternoon." "Mrs. Blackwell," Thomas acknowledged, signaling to Charlie that the call was important. "I apologize for not returning your calls. We've been somewhat occupied." "I imagine so," she replied dryly. "Bradford has been on a rampage since the auction. He's convinced our family lawyer that the horse was never meant to be sold, and he's preparing legal action to force its return." "We're already aware," Thomas informed her. "They paid us a visit this morning. Your lawyer and the local sheriff." Eleanor sighed deeply. "I feared as much. Bradford has also taken steps to restrict my movements. He's told the staff that I'm unwell and shouldn't be disturbed. My nurse is sympathetic, thankfully, which is why I'm able to make this call, but I'm effectively under house arrest." Thomas frowned, concerned by this development. "Has he prevented you from seeing your husband?" "Not yet. Winston's condition makes it difficult for Bradford to completely isolate him. The medical staff would become suspicious." There was a pause before she continued, her voice lower now. "I've spoken with Winston about what's happening. Though his speech is impaired, his mind remains sharp. He was devastated to learn the truth about Spirit." Thomas could imagine the pain Winston must have felt, learning that the horse he had cherished had been alive all these years, hidden away through his own son's deception. "Mrs. Blackwell, we're moving Spirit to a secure location tonight. Once he's safe, we'll begin gathering evidence to expose what Bradford has done." "Be careful," Eleanor warned. "Bradford has resources you may not be aware of. He's expanded the family's connections in troubling directions over the past few years. Some of his business associates operate in gray areas of the law." This confirmed Thomas's worst suspicions about the younger Blackwell. "We're taking precautions," he assured her. "But we could use your help. If you could document what you know about Bradford's actions, particularly anything related to falsified records or misappropriation of company resources." "I've already begun," Eleanor interrupted. "Winston has been keeping files on Bradford's questionable business decisions for years. He never confronted our son directly, hoping Bradford would mature into the role, but he documented everything. Those files are in a safe place." Thomas felt a surge of hope at this news. With Winston's records and the evidence they could gather through Spirit, they might have a real chance of building a case against Bradford. "There's something else you should know," Eleanor continued, her voice becoming urgent. "Bradford has scheduled a press conference for tomorrow afternoon. I believe he intends to publicly accuse you of horse theft and fraud. He's prepared a narrative painting you as a bitter, confused old man trying to reclaim past glory through criminal means." The coldness of this strategy took Thomas aback. Bradford was moving faster than anticipated, already taking steps to discredit any claims Thomas might make about Spirit's true identity. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Thomas said, thinking rapidly. "Mrs. Blackwell, can you get those files from Winston to me within the next 24 hours? "I'll find a way," she promised. "But be careful, Thomas. Bradford won't hesitate to destroy you if he feels threatened." After ending the call, Thomas relayed the information to Charlie, who whistled low. "A press conference? That's aggressive. He's trying to control the narrative before we can even present our side." Which means we need to be ready with our counter-move, Thomas replied grimly. Once we've secured Spirit at Churchill Downs and transferred the tracking chip, I want to contact Raymond Sullivan at the Racing Commission. Ray and I go back 40 years. He'll at least give us a fair hearing. Charlie nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. And if Bradford's people try to intercept us before we reach Churchill Downs? Then we implement Plan B, Thomas said firmly. We've come too far to back down now. They drove in tense silence for another hour, the Louisville skyline gradually appearing on the horizon. As they approached the outskirts of the city, Charlie suddenly tensed. Tom, I think we've got company. Black SUV, 2 cars back. It's been with us since we hit the interstate. Thomas checked the side mirror. The vehicle Charlie had spotted was hanging back at a consistent distance, headlights on bright, making it difficult to see the driver or any passengers. Could be coincidence, he said, not believing it himself. And now there's another one, Charlie noted, nodding toward an identical SUV that had just pulled onto the highway from an entrance ramp ahead of them. They're trying to box us in. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The strategy was clear. One vehicle behind, one ahead, forcing them to continue on their current path toward Churchill Downs. Bradford's people were either planning to intercept them at the track or were simply monitoring their movements for now. Don't panic, Thomas instructed, trying to follow his own advice. They're just watching us. If they wanted to force us off the road, they would have done it on a quieter stretch. What do we do? Charlie asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Thomas considered their options. The Churchill Downs plan had been compromised. If Bradford's men followed them all the way to the track, they'd never be able to execute the chip transfer without being observed. Take the next exit, Thomas decided. Let's see if they follow or try to stop us. Charlie signaled and began moving toward the exit lane. The SUV behind them immediately closed the gap, while the one ahead slowed noticeably. They're definitely watching us, Charlie confirmed, his voice tight. As they approached the exit ramp, Thomas made a split-second decision. Don't take the exit. Accelerate past it, then take the next one instead. Charlie nodded, his jaw set. He canceled the turn signal and pressed down on the accelerator, pushing the truck and trailer past the exit. In the mirror, Thomas saw the trailing SUV swerve at the last moment, nearly missing the exit but managing to stay on their tail. They're good, Thomas muttered. Professional. Not just hired muscle, Charlie agreed grimly. Bradford's not taking any chances. They continued down the interstate, the trailing SUV maintaining its position while the lead vehicle had disappeared, presumably to reposition itself at the next exit. Thomas's mind raced. Their original plan was no longer viable, but they couldn't simply return to the farm. Bradford's men would follow them, and once they realized Spirit was there, they might attempt to seize him by force, regardless of legalities. Head for Jesse's place directly, Thomas decided. If we can't transfer the chip, we'll have to risk Bradford tracking Spirit there. At least Jesse's facility has proper security. Charlie nodded, changing lanes to position themselves for the upcoming exit that would take them east, toward the hills where Jesse Morgan's training facility was located. As they did, Thomas's phone rang again. Yes, he answered tersely, expecting Eleanor with more updates. Instead, a young male voice responded. Mr. Abernathy, it's Miguel again. I don't have much time, but you need to know. They've been tracking you since you left your farm. We've noticed, Thomas replied dryly. 2 black SUVs. There are more, Miguel warned. Mr. Bradford has hired a private security firm. They have 4 vehicles total, plus a helicopter on standby. Thomas's blood ran cold. A helicopter? Yes, sir. They're taking this very seriously. Mr. Bradford has been making calls all day, telling people you've stolen a valuable breeding prospect. He's building a case against you. So we've heard, Thomas acknowledged. Miguel, why are you helping us? You're putting yourself at considerable risk. There was a pause before the young man answered. I've worked with the Blackwell horses for 5 years. I was there when Spirit had his accident. I was the one who found him, broken and bleeding on the track. His voice grew thick with emotion. Mr. Bradford ordered me to stay silent when they faked the euthanasia. I've been living with that guilt ever since. That horse deserved better." Thomas felt a wave of gratitude toward this young man he had never met. "Thank you for your courage, Miguel. Is there anything else we should know?" "Just one thing. The tracking chip has a battery life of about 3 days when it's actively monitored. After that, it needs to be recharged through a special device Bradford keeps in his office. If you can keep Spirit hidden for that long, the chip will stop transmitting." This was valuable information. "Thank you, Miguel. Stay safe." After ending the call, Thomas updated Charlie on this new development. "We need to keep moving for the next 3 days, changing locations frequently to keep Bradford's people guessing." Charlie shook his head in disbelief. "A helicopter? Bradford's treating this like a military operation." "He's desperate," Thomas replied. "Which means we're on the right track. Whatever secret Spirit holds, they're damaging enough that Bradford is willing to go to extraordinary lengths to keep them hidden." As they exited the interstate, Thomas checked the mirrors again. The black SUV remained a constant presence behind them, not aggressive but unmistakably present. "They're just going to follow us to Jesse's," Charlie observed. Thomas nodded grimly. "Yes." But Jessie was prepared for that possibility. She has friends in local law enforcement who won't be intimidated by Bradford's money. Once we're on her property, they'll need a court order to come after Spirit. And by then, Charlie added, the tracking chip will have died, giving us more freedom to move him if necessary. Thomas settled back in his seat, watching the familiar Kentucky landscape roll by in the darkness. They had a plan, not the one they'd started with, but a plan nonetheless. Bradford Blackwell might have resources and influence, but Thomas had something perhaps more valuable: the truth, and people willing to help him reveal it. As they drove deeper into the hills, Spirit stood calmly in the trailer, unaware of the battle being waged over his future. Thomas thought again of Winston's journal entries, the suspicions about tampering before the fateful accident. Whatever had happened 7 years ago, the time for truth was finally approaching. "Almost there," Charlie announced as they turned onto the private road leading to Jesse Morgan's facility. "Let's hope Jesse's as ready for visitors as we are." Jesse Morgan's training facility sat nestled in a valley surrounded by wooded hills, its pristine white fences gleaming under powerful security lights. As Thomas and Charlie approached the main gate, they could see that Jesse had taken their situation seriously. 2 men in security uniforms stood at the entrance, and the gate itself was firmly closed. One of the guards stepped forward as Charlie slowed the truck. "Evening, gentlemen. Ms. Morgan is expecting you." Thomas leaned across Charlie to speak with the guard. "We've picked up some unwanted company along the way, black SUV about half a mile back." The guard nodded, unsurprised. Ms. Morgan anticipated that possibility. "We've been instructed not to allow anyone onto the property without her explicit authorization." He stepped back and pressed a code into the keypad. The gate swung open smoothly. "Pull through and continue straight to the main barn. We'll handle any visitors." Charlie drove through, and Thomas watched in the side mirror as the gate closed immediately behind them. The guard spoke briefly into a radio, then resumed his position with his colleague. "Jesse's not taking any chances," Charlie observed as they followed the winding driveway toward the central complex of buildings. "She never does," Thomas replied. "It's why her clients trust her with their $1 million dressage horses." The main barn was a large, modern structure with state-of-the-art amenities. As they pulled up outside, Jessie herself emerged to greet them. Though in her 50s, she moved with the athletic grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. Her salt-and-pepper hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her expression was alert and focused. "Thomas," she said, embracing him briefly. "It's been too long. Jesse, thank you for doing this on such short notice." She waved away his gratitude. "After everything you taught me when I was starting out, this is the least I can do." She glanced past them toward the gate. "Your followers arrived yet?" "Should be here any minute," Charlie confirmed. Jesse nodded. "Good. I've notified the county sheriff that I've received threats against some of my valuable horses. 2 deputies are parked just down the road, waiting to intercept any unauthorized visitors. She turned her attention to the trailer. This must be the famous Spirit. Thomas couldn't help but smile at her matter-of-fact approach. He is, though Bradford Blackwell would have the world believe he's just a mediocre breeding prospect named Windcatcher. Well, let's get him settled before our uninvited guests make a scene, Jesse said, leading the way to the rear of the trailer. With practiced efficiency, they unloaded Spirit and led him into the barn. Unlike Thomas's modest facility, Jesse's barn featured spacious stalls with automatic waterers, climate control, and rubber flooring for optimal comfort and safety. She had prepared a corner stall with extra bedding and a view of the surrounding paddocks. "He'll be comfortable here," she assured Thomas as they removed Spirit's halter. "I've assigned my most trusted groom to care for him, and no one else will have access to this section of the barn." Spirit seemed to approve of his new accommodations, walking the perimeter of the stall before lowering his head to investigate the fresh hay. Thomas watched him with a mixture of pride and concern. "He seems to be handling all this change remarkably well." "Good horses often do," Jesse replied. "They read our energy. If we stay calm, they trust that everything is under control." She turned to face Thomas directly. "Now, how about you tell me the full story? Your phone call left out quite a few details." Thomas hesitated, but Charlie nodded encouragingly. "She needs to know what she's getting into, Tom." Over the next half hour, as they settled Spirit and checked him for any stress from the journey, Thomas explained everything. Spirit's supposed euthanasia, Bradford's deception, the falsified documents, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the original accident. Jessie listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. "And you're certain this horse is Spirit?" she asked finally. "After 7 years, memory can be—" "It's him," Thomas said firmly. "The markings, the scar below the mane, the white crescent inside his left ear, they're all unique to Spirit. Plus, Charlie confirmed that the registration microchip matches Spirit's original number. And now Bradford Blackwell is hunting you with private security and helicopter support," Jessie summarized, shaking her head in disbelief. "You certainly don't do things halfway in your retirement, Thomas." Before he could respond, one of the security guards appeared at the barn entrance. "Ms. Morgan, we have 2 vehicles at the gate. 4 men, claiming to represent Blackwell thoroughbreds. They're demanding access to the property." Jessie straightened, her expression hardening. "Tell them this is private property, and they are not authorized to enter. If they persist, remind them that the sheriff's deputies parked down the road would be very interested in potential trespassing charges." The guard nodded and departed to deliver the message. Jessie turned back to Thomas and Charlie. "They won't give up easily. Even with the deputies there, they'll find a way to maintain surveillance on this place." "The tracking chip," Thomas reminded them. "According to Miguel, it has a 3-day battery life. If we can keep Spirit here, secure and unharmed for that long, they'll lose their ability to track him." "And then what?" Jessie asked. "Bradford will still pursue legal channels. He'll get a court order eventually. By then, we'll have gathered enough evidence to contest it," Thomas replied, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. "Eleanor Blackwell is sending Winston's files on Bradford's business practices. We're going to contact the Racing Commission tomorrow. Once we establish Spirit's true identity, Bradford's falsification of euthanasia documents becomes a serious violation of racing regulations." Jessie considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right, I've got your back for as long as you need, but we should prepare for Bradford to escalate. Men like him don't accept defeat gracefully." As if to underscore her point, the security guard returned, his expression tense. "They've stationed themselves at the end of the driveway, Ms. Morgan. Said they'd wait as long as necessary. Also, there's a helicopter circling the area now. Not directly overhead, but definitely monitoring the property." Thomas exchanged a worried glance with Charlie. Bradford was deploying serious resources remarkably quickly. "Let's finish settling Spirit in," Jessie suggested calmly. "Then we should get some rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day." They completed Spirit's care routine, making sure he had everything he needed for the night. Thomas lingered at the stall door, watching the horse with a mixture of emotions. After believing for so long that Spirit was gone forever, having him back felt like a miracle, one worth fighting for, regardless of the obstacles Bradford Blackwell might place in their path. "He'll be safe here tonight," Jesse assured him, gently leading Thomas away from the stall. "I have night staff who will check on him regularly." They made their way to the comfortable apartment above the barn office, where Jesse had prepared accommodations for them. Despite his exhaustion, Thomas found sleep elusive. He sat at the small kitchen table, reading through Winston's journal again by the dim light of a single lamp. Charlie had already fallen asleep on the sofa, his soft snores providing a rhythmic backdrop to Thomas's thoughts. Around midnight, Thomas's phone vibrated with an incoming message. It was from an unknown number, but the content made the sender's identity clear. "Files being delivered to you tomorrow by trusted courier. Winston insists on seeing Spirit when it's safe. Bradford has convinced board members to call emergency session, trying to gain complete control of company while Winston is ill. Be careful. E." Thomas rubbed his tired eyes. Eleanor's message confirmed what he had suspected. This was about much more than one horse. Bradford was making a power play for the entire Blackwell empire, using Winston's illness as an opportunity to consolidate his control. Spirit was just one loose end he needed to tie up, one potential threat to his narrative of competent leadership. A soft knock at the apartment door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas rose stiffly, his old joints protesting the long day of tension and activity. Jessie stood in the hallway, her expression serious. "You should see this," she said, holding up a tablet. On the screen was a news website featuring a just-published article. "Blackwell Thoroughbreds reports theft of valuable breeding prospect." The piece included a photo of Thomas, clearly taken at the auction, alongside allegations that he had conspired with an unnamed Blackwell employee to illegally acquire a horse that was never intended for sale. "They're moving faster than expected," Thomas observed grimly. "There's more," Jesse said, scrolling down to reveal quotes from several prominent figures in the racing industry, all expressing shock at the allegations against Thomas and offering their support to Bradford Blackwell. "He's rallying the industry against you before you can even present your evidence." Thomas felt a chill of apprehension. Bradford was methodically cutting off potential allies, poisoning the well of industry opinion before Thomas could make his case. "We need to accelerate our timeline," he decided. "First thing tomorrow, we'll document Spirit's identifying characteristics. Photographs, detailed descriptions, comparison with Winston's notes. Then we contact Ray Sullivan at the Racing Commission directly. Bypass the normal channels." Jessie nodded her agreement. "I'll help. I've got a professional photographer who works with my clients' horses. She's discreet and thorough." "Thank you," Thomas said sincerely. "For all of this." Jessie's expression softened. "You were the one who gave me my start, Thomas. When no one else would hire a female trainer, you took a chance on me. I haven't forgotten." After she left, Thomas returned to the table, his determination renewed. Bradford Blackwell might have money, connections, and a head start in the court of public opinion, but Thomas had truth on his side, and allies who couldn't be bought. He opened Winston's journal again, this time focusing on the entries immediately preceding Spirit's accident. Something had been nagging at him, a detail he'd overlooked. On his third reading of a particular entry, he found it. JR mentioned seeing Bradford near Spirit's stall late last night. Said he appeared to be examining the tack. Probably just checking quality, but Spirit seemed agitated this morning. We'll have vet check him to be safe. JR, Juan Reyes, Spirit's jockey at the time. The same jockey who had expressed concerns about equipment tampering. Thomas had assumed Juan had left the industry after Spirit's accident. But what if he was still around? His testimony about Bradford's behavior before the accident could be crucial. Thomas made a note to try to locate Juan first thing in the morning. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture of deliberate sabotage rather than a tragic accident. If they could prove Bradford had intentionally caused Spirit's career-ending injury, it would be more than a racing violation. It would be criminal. Outside, the distant sound of the helicopter continued its rhythmic thrum, a reminder that Bradford's surveillance remained in place. Thomas closed the journal and moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape of Jesse's farm. Somewhere out there, Bradford's men were watching, waiting for an opportunity to seize Spirit and silence the truth the horse represented. "Not this time," Thomas murmured to himself. "This time, the truth comes out." With renewed resolve, he finally allowed himself to rest, knowing that the real battle would begin with the morning light. Dawn broke with a clarity that belied the tension hanging over Jesse Morgan's farm. Thomas had risen early, standing at the window with a cup of strong coffee, observing the black SUVs still positioned at the end of the long driveway. They had maintained their vigil through the night, a silent but unmistakable message from Bradford Blackwell. "I'm watching, and I'm not going away." "Any change?" Charlie asked, joining Thomas at the window. "None. They're committed to the siege approach." Thomas sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "But so are we." Jessie entered the apartment, already dressed in riding clothes, her face set with determination. "My security team reports the helicopter left around 3 a.m., probably for refueling. It hasn't returned yet, but they're expecting it." "Good morning to you too," Charlie said wryly. Jessie managed a brief smile. "Sorry, not much for pleasantries when there's work to be done." She poured herself coffee and joined them at the table. "The photographer will be here at 8. I've also called my veterinarian, Dr. Simmons, to examine Spirit and document his condition, including any evidence of past injuries that match what would be expected from Spirit's accident." Thomas nodded appreciatively. "I've been thinking about another angle. Spirit's jockey at the time of the accident, Juan Reyes. He had concerns about equipment tampering before the incident. If we could locate him, get his testimony." "Juan Reyes," Jessie repeated, her brow furrowing in concentration. "I believe he's working at Santa Anita now. One of my clients mentioned seeing him there last season." "Can you reach out?" Thomas asked. "He might be more receptive to a call from a current industry professional than from me." "I'll try," Jessie agreed. "But first, let's check on Spirit." They made their way down to the barn, where the night staff reported that Spirit had passed a quiet night, eating well and showing no signs of stress from the move. Thomas entered the stall, running his hands gently over the horse's body, checking for any issues that might have developed overnight. Spirit responded to his touch with the quiet trust of an animal who recognized a friend. "His leg is warm," Thomas noted, examining the old injury site. "Not surprising after the trailer ride, but we should have Dr. Simmons look at it carefully." Charlie joined him in the stall, his veterinarian's instincts kicking in as he assessed the horse. "The muscle tone isn't what it should be for a horse his age. He hasn't been exercised properly in years. Bradford was maintaining him just well enough to serve as a mediocre breeding stallion," Thomas said bitterly. "No real care, no rehabilitation for his injuries." They were interrupted by the arrival of Jesse's security chief, a former military man named Dawson. "Ms. Morgan, there's a courier at the gate claiming to have a delivery for Mr. Abernathy from Eleanor Blackwell." Thomas exchanged a quick glance with Jessie. "That would be Winston's files. Eleanor said she'd send them with a trusted courier." Jessie nodded to Dawson. "Check their credentials carefully, then escort them directly to the barn office." While they waited, Jesse's staff prepared Spirit for his documentation session, grooming him meticulously to ensure all identifying markings would be clearly visible. Thomas supervised closely, occasionally consulting Winston's journal to confirm specific details. The courier, a gray-haired woman who introduced herself only as an old friend of Eleanor's, delivered a sealed document case to Thomas personally. "Mrs. Blackwell said you would understand the significance of these materials," she stated formally. "She also asked me to inform you that Mr. Blackwell's condition has taken a turn. The doctors are concerned." Thomas accepted the case, troubled by this news. "Is Winston stable enough for visitors?" The courier's expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Blackwell suggested that if you have evidence confirming the horse's identity, it might be meaningful for Mr. Blackwell to receive that information soon." The implication was clear. Winston's time was running out. Thomas thanked the courier, who departed as discreetly as she had arrived. In the privacy of the barn office, Thomas opened the document case. Inside were meticulously organized folders containing financial records, breeding program notes, and internal memos spanning the past decade of Blackwell Thoroughbreds operations. A separate envelope contained a letter from Eleanor explaining the most significant points and where to find clear evidence of Bradford's misconduct. "This is more than I expected," Thomas admitted, spreading the documents across the desk. "Bradford's been systematically undermining Winston's breeding philosophy for years, selling off promising bloodlines, importing questionable foreign stock at inflated prices." Charlie examined a particular spreadsheet closely. "There's evidence of kickbacks here. Bradford's been receiving personal payments from certain European breeders whose horses he purchased for the Blackwell program. That explains his determination to shift away from Winston's carefully developed bloodlines," Thomas realized. It wasn't just a disagreement about breeding philosophy. It was financial self-interest. Jesse, who had been reviewing another set of documents, looked up sharply. According to these notes, Spirit's bloodline represented Winston's greatest achievement, the culmination of 3 generations of selective breeding. If Spirit had succeeded as expected, it would have validated Winston's approach and made it much harder for Bradford to push his alternative direction. So Spirit had to fail, Thomas concluded grimly. Bradford couldn't allow him to succeed. Their analysis was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Simmons, a precise, efficient woman in her 40s, and the photographer, a young woman with multiple cameras and specialized lighting equipment. For the next 2 hours, they documented Spirit's condition in exacting detail, every marking, scar, and physical characteristic that could help establish his identity. Dr. Simmons was particularly thorough in her examination of Spirit's old injury. The scar tissue and bone remodeling are consistent with a serious tendon and bone injury that occurred approximately 5 to 7 years ago, she confirmed. With proper rehabilitation, this injury could have healed much more completely. The horse has been neglected, medically speaking. The photographer captured everything, creating a comprehensive visual record that would be difficult to dispute. "I've included scale references in each shot," she explained to Thomas, "and I'm shooting with metadata intact so the time and date of each image can be verified." By mid-morning, they had assembled a compelling documentation package. Thomas called Raymond Sullivan at the Racing Commission, relieved when his old friend agreed to meet them personally that afternoon. "Ray's taking a risk," Thomas told the others after ending the call. "Bradford has already begun his media campaign against me. Agreeing to this meeting could put Ray in a difficult position professionally." "All the more reason to make sure our evidence is irrefutable," Jesse responded. Thomas nodded, turning his attention to the most immediate challenge. "We need to get Spirit to the Racing Commission office in Lexington without Bradford's people intercepting us." Charlie gestured toward the window where the black SUVs remained visible at the property entrance. "They're still watching every move we make, and the tracking chip in Spirit is still active." "Which means we need a diversion," Jesse said thoughtfully. "Something to draw Bradford's attention while we move Spirit by another route." Thomas considered the problem. If Bradford is tracking Spirit's movements, we need to give him something to follow, something that will lead his people away from our actual route to Lexington. "A decoy trailer," Charlie suggested. "We could transfer the tracking chip to another horse, send it in the opposite direction." Jesse shook her head. "Too risky for the chip transfer, and I'm not putting another horse in potential danger." Thomas snapped his fingers as an idea formed. "We don't need another horse, just the chip." He turned to Charlie. "You said the chip is near Spirit's right ear, correct?" Charlie nodded. "Just at the base. If we carefully remove it without damaging it, could we place it in something else? Something that could be transported in another direction while we take Spirit to Lexington?" Dr. Simmons, who had been listening to the discussion, stepped forward. "I could extract the chip safely. It's a simple subcutaneous implant, but whatever we put it in would need to maintain body temperature, or it might trigger an alert in sophisticated tracking systems." "What about a heated container?" Jesse suggested. "I have specialized shipping units for biological samples. They maintain a constant temperature." Thomas nodded eagerly. "Perfect. We place the chip in the heated container, send it off in one direction with one of your staff, while we take Spirit to Lexington by a completely different route." Dr. Simmons agreed to perform the chip extraction immediately. Under local anesthesia, she carefully removed the small device from Spirit's neck, confirming it was indeed an advanced tracking chip, not standard veterinary equipment. "This is military-grade technology," she noted with concern, "far beyond what would be used for normal livestock tracking." The chip was placed in Jessie's heated container, which was then entrusted to one of her most reliable exercise riders. The young woman would drive west toward Paducah, creating an electronic trail that Bradford's team would surely follow. "That buys us a window of opportunity," Thomas said as they watched the decoy vehicle depart through a back entrance to the property. "But we need to move quickly. Once they realize they've been tricked, they'll head straight to the racing commission." Jessie had already arranged for a different horse trailer, one belonging to a client who had recently delivered a horse for training. "It has California plates and no connection to any of us," she explained. "We'll take the Eastern Access Road that connects to Route 27. It's longer but less likely to be watched." Thomas gathered the documentation package, Winston's journal, and Eleanor's files. Charlie and Dr. Simmons prepared Spirit for another journey, administering a mild sedative to keep him calm during transport. "I'm coming with you," Jessie announced as they prepared to depart. "You'll need someone to handle the trailer and stay with Spirit while you meet with Sullivan." Thomas didn't argue. Jessie's expertise and determination had already proven invaluable, and he suspected they weren't out of the woods yet. They loaded Spirit into the unfamiliar trailer, the horse compliant under the effects of the sedative. Thomas checked his watch. They had a 2-hour drive to Lexington, and their appointment with Ray Sullivan was in 3 hours. If the decoy plan worked, they might just make it without interference from Bradford's team. As they pulled away from the training facility through the back entrance, Thomas gazed at the rolling Kentucky landscape. Somewhere out there, Bradford's men were following a heated container carrying a tiny chip, believing they were tracking the horse whose very existence threatened to unravel Bradford's carefully constructed web of deception. "Do you think it will work?" Charlie asked from the driver's seat, his eyes constantly checking the mirrors for any sign of pursuit. "It has to," Thomas replied simply, "for Spirit's sake, and for Winston's." The journey to Lexington began in tense silence, each of them aware that the clock was ticking not just on their meeting with Sullivan, but potentially on Winston Blackwell's life as well. If they could validate Spirit's identity in time for Winston to know the truth before he passed, it would be a small victory amid the larger battle. But first, they had to reach Lexington safely and convince the Racing Commission that one of Kentucky's most prominent horse breeders had perpetrated a fraud that shook the very foundation of the industry's integrity. The Kentucky countryside rolled past as they made their way toward Lexington, taking the longer route to avoid main highways where Bradford's people might be watching. Charlie drove with the focused intensity of a man who understood the stakes, while Jessie kept a vigilant eye on Spirit through the trailer's monitoring camera. Thomas sat silently, reviewing the documentation they had assembled, mentally preparing for the confrontation that awaited them at the Racing Commission. "No sign of pursuit," Charlie announced after the first hour of driving. "Looks like our decoy plan is working." "For now," Jessie cautioned. "Bradford's not a fool. Once they realize they're following an empty signal, they'll regroup quickly." Thomas nodded in agreement. "Which is why we need to make the most of our meeting with Ray Sullivan. If we can convince him to launch an official investigation before Bradford intervenes, we'll have the Commission's protection." The Racing Commission offices were housed in a modern building on the outskirts of Lexington, its glass facade reflecting the cloudy afternoon sky. They arrived 30 minutes before their scheduled meeting, parking the trailer in a secluded corner of the lot where Spirit could remain undisturbed. "I'll stay with him," Jessie offered. "You two go ahead with the evidence." Thomas and Charlie gathered their materials and headed toward the entrance. Before they could reach it, however, the doors opened, and Raymond Sullivan himself emerged to meet them. In his 60s, with a distinguished silver beard and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent a lifetime at racetracks, Ray had been a steward with the Commission for over 20 years. "Thomas?" he greeted them, his expression grave. "We need to talk before you come inside." Thomas felt a flicker of concern. "What's happened, Ray?" Sullivan glanced around the parking lot before responding. Bradford Blackwell called an emergency meeting with 3 of our commissioners this morning. He's filed formal complaints against you for fraud, theft, and defamation. He's also seeking an emergency injunction to have the horse returned to Blackwell Thoroughbreds immediately. Thomas's heart sank. He's moving faster than we anticipated. That's not all, Sullivan continued, lowering his voice. He brought documentation showing that the horse you purchased, Windcatcher, has absolutely no connection to the thoroughbred known as Spirit. According to their records, Spirit was humanely euthanized 7 years ago following catastrophic injuries. They have veterinary certificates, witness statements, the works. Falsified, Thomas insisted, opening his portfolio to reveal the evidence they had gathered. We have Winston Blackwell's personal breeding journal documenting Spirit's unique characteristics, all of which match this horse. We have photographic evidence, veterinary confirmation of the old injury that matches the type Spirit sustained. And we have Eleanor Blackwell's testimony that Bradford orchestrated the deception while Winston was away. Sullivan's eyes widened slightly. Eleanor is involved in this? Directly, Thomas confirmed. She provided us with Winston's private files documenting Bradford's systematic dismantling of Winston's breeding program, including financial irregularities that suggest personal enrichment at the company's expense. Sullivan rubbed his beard thoughtfully. This is explosive stuff, Thomas. If you're right, it's one of the biggest scandals in Kentucky racing history. I'm right, Thomas said firmly. And I can prove it. The horse is here in the trailer. You can examine him yourself. Sullivan hesitated, clearly torn between his professional responsibilities and his long friendship with Thomas. The commissioners Bradford spoke with are waiting for my assessment. I told them I wanted to hear your side before making any recommendations. Then let's not waste time, Thomas urged. The horse is the evidence, Ray. One look at him, one comparison with Winston's detailed notes, and you'll know the truth. Sullivan nodded slowly. All right, let's see this horse. They led him to the trailer, where Jesse had already lowered the ramp in anticipation. Spirit stood calmly inside, his ears pricked forward at the sight of new people. Sullivan climbed into the trailer carefully, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the horse before him. May I? He asked, gesturing toward Spirit. Thomas nodded. He's gentle. Just move slowly. Sullivan approached Spirit with the quiet confidence of a lifelong horseman. He examined the animal methodically, checking the markings described in Winston's journal, the distinctive scar pattern from the old injury, the unique crescent mark inside the left ear. I was at Churchill Downs the day Spirit had his accident, Sullivan said quietly, his hand still moving over the horse. I've never seen a more promising 3-year-old. Everyone said he had Triple Crown potential. He stepped back, his expression troubled. This is him, Thomas. I'd stake my professional reputation on it. Thomas felt a surge of validation. Then you'll help us? Sullivan's response was interrupted by the sound of vehicles pulling into the parking lot at high speed. Through the open trailer door, they could see 2 black SUVs and a luxury sedan coming to a stop near the building entrance. Bradford, Thomas muttered, recognizing the tall figure emerging from the sedan. He must have realized the tracking chip was a decoy. Sullivan moved quickly to the trailer door. Stay here. Let me handle this initially. They watched as Sullivan intercepted Bradford and his entourage, which included Diane Harper, the lawyer who had visited Thomas's farm, and 2 men whose bearing suggested security personnel rather than legal assistance. Commissioner Sullivan, Bradford called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. I understand you're meeting with Thomas Abernathy regarding stolen Blackwell property. I insist on being present for any such discussion. Sullivan stood his ground. Mr. Blackwell, this is a preliminary fact-finding meeting. If it proceeds to a formal hearing, all parties will have appropriate representation. Bradford's face darkened. That horse belongs to Blackwell Thoroughbreds. We have documentation proving it was never eligible for sale. I demand its immediate return. The ownership dispute is noted, Sullivan replied evenly. But there are now additional allegations that need to be investigated. allegations of falsified euthanasia records and identity fraud regarding a thoroughbred named Spirit. At the mention of Spirit, Bradford's composure visibly slipped. That's absurd. Spirit was euthanized years ago. There are records, witnesses, which we will review thoroughly, Sullivan interrupted. Along with the evidence Mr. Abernathy has presented suggesting otherwise. Bradford took a step closer to Sullivan, his voice dropping to a threatening murmur that didn't quite reach the trailer. Whatever he said caused Sullivan's expression to harden. That sounds remarkably like an attempt to intimidate a racing commission official, Mr. Blackwell, Sullivan said loudly enough for everyone to hear. I'd advise against continuing in that vein. Bradford stepped back, visibly recalculating his approach. His eyes scanned the parking lot, coming to rest on the trailer where Thomas stood watching. With a quick word to his associates, he began striding purposefully toward them. We need to move, Thomas said urgently to Jesse and Charlie. If Bradford gets a close look at Spirit, he might try something desperate. Jesse nodded, already moving to close the trailer ramp. Where to? We can't exactly flee with the racing commissioner watching. Before Thomas could respond, a new vehicle entered the parking lot. An ambulance, its lights flashing but sirens silent. It parked near the building entrance, and two paramedics emerged, followed by an elegant older woman who Thomas immediately recognized as Eleanor Blackwell. Bradford froze mid-stride, clearly shocked by his mother's appearance. Sullivan hurried over to Eleanor, offering his arm for support as she approached the group. Mother, Bradford called out, his voice a mix of surprise and anger. You shouldn't be here. Your health is not your concern at the moment, Eleanor cut him off sharply. I've brought Winston. He insisted on seeing Spirit for himself when I told him the truth. A murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered. Several racing commission employees had emerged from the building, drawn by the unfolding drama. The paramedics opened the ambulance's rear doors and carefully extracted a gurney bearing Winston Blackwell, once the towering figure of Kentucky horse breeding, now frail and diminished by illness. Thomas felt a lump form in his throat at the sight of his old employer and mentor. Winston had aged decades in the 7 years since Thomas had last seen him, his powerful frame now skeletal, his commanding presence reduced to a pale shadow. Yet his eyes remained alert, scanning the surroundings until they locked onto Thomas. With a shaking hand, Winston gestured for the gurney to be brought forward. Eleanor walked beside him, her face a mask of dignified determination. Bradford stood frozen, seemingly unable to process this unexpected development. Thomas. Winston's voice was barely audible, a rasp that required complete silence to hear. Is it true? Did you find him? Thomas moved closer, kneeling beside the gurney to speak directly to Winston. Yes, sir. Spirit is alive. He's here. Winston's eyes filled with tears. I want to see him, please. Thomas looked to the paramedics, who exchanged uncertain glances. Is it safe to move him closer to the trailer? Briefly, one responded, but he shouldn't be exposed to the elements for long. With careful coordination, they wheeled Winston's gurney toward the horse trailer. Bradford suddenly snapped out of his shock and moved to intercept them. This is outrageous, he shouted. Father is in no condition to be involved in this charade. Mother, how could you— Enough, Bradford. Eleanor's voice cut through her son's protests with surprising strength. Your father deserves to know what you've done. All of it. Sullivan stepped forward, positioning himself between Bradford and the gurney. Mr. Blackwell, I strongly advise you to step back and allow this to proceed. The Commission will investigate all aspects of this situation thoroughly, but this moment belongs to your father. Bradford's face contorted with rage, but the presence of too many witnesses seemed to check his impulse to interfere further. He retreated a few steps, watching with barely contained fury as they positioned Winston's gurney where he could see into the trailer. Jessie had lowered the ramp again, and now she led Spirit forward carefully until he stood framed in the trailer doorway. The horse's ears pricked forward, his intelligent eyes taking in the unusual scene before him. Winston made a soft sound that might have been the horse's name. Tears streamed freely down his sunken cheeks as he raised a trembling hand toward Spirit. In a moment that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life, Spirit stepped delicately down the ramp and approached Winston's gurney. With infinite gentleness, the horse lowered his head until his muzzle nearly touched Winston's outstretched fingers. "He remembers," Winston whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "After all this time, he remembers." Eleanor stood beside her husband, one hand on his shoulder, the other reaching to stroke Spirit's neck. "Of course he does," she said softly. "He was your greatest achievement, Winston. Your legacy." The tableau held for several heartbeats, the dying breeder, his loyal wife, and the horse that connected them across years of deception. Around them, even the most hardened racing officials seemed moved by the reunion. Bradford, however, was not. His face had shifted from rage to calculation, his eyes darting between his parents, the horse, and the gathering crowd. Thomas recognized the look of a man reassessing his options, seeking a new angle of attack. "This proves nothing," Bradford announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My father is sadly diminished by his illness. His emotional reaction to a similar-looking horse is understandable but meaningless from an evidentiary standpoint." Sullivan turned to face him. "Mr. Blackwell, the Commission will make its own determination based on all available evidence. In the meantime, I'm ordering that the horse remain under Commission supervision until this matter is resolved." Bradford's jaw tightened. "And what about the theft charges against Abernathy? The fraud allegations?" "Those will be investigated as part of the same proceeding," Sullivan assured him. "No aspect of this situation will be overlooked." As the confrontation continued, Thomas remained beside Winston and Spirit, witnessing the profound connection between man and horse. Whatever happened next, this moment of truth and reunion had made all their efforts worthwhile. Winston beckoned Thomas closer. "Thank you," he breathed, each word clearly costing him precious energy. "For finding him, for bringing him home." "He was never really gone," Thomas replied gently. "Just waiting to be found again." Winston nodded slightly, his eyelids growing heavy with exhaustion. The paramedics moved forward, indicating that he needed to return to the ambulance. As they prepared to wheel him away, Winston suddenly gripped Thomas's wrist with surprising strength. "The accident," he whispered urgently. "Not an accident. Bradford, sabotaged. Look at the films." Thomas leaned closer. "What films, Winston?" But Winston's burst of energy had passed. His eyes closed, and his hand fell away as the paramedics carefully moved the gurney back toward the ambulance. Eleanor lingered a moment longer, her hand still resting on Spirit's neck. "Winston had security cameras installed in the training areas years ago," she said quietly, for Thomas's ears alone. "The footage was archived. Bradford doesn't know." With that cryptic message, she followed her husband, leaving Thomas to process this new piece of information that might prove crucial in exposing the full extent of Bradford's deception. As Spirit was led back into the trailer, Thomas caught Bradford's eye across the parking lot. The younger Blackwell's expression was cold, calculating, and unmistakably dangerous. The battle was far from over. In fact, Thomas suspected it was about to enter its most perilous phase. The following week unfolded like a carefully orchestrated chess match, with Bradford Blackwell and Thomas Abernathy as the principal players. The Racing Commission had placed Spirit under protective custody at a neutral facility, with round-the-clock security, ensuring that neither party could access the horse without supervision. Raymond Sullivan had launched a formal investigation, interviewing dozens of witnesses and reviewing mountains of documentation. Thomas had established temporary residence in a small hotel in Lexington, converting his room into a makeshift command center. Spread across the bed and desk were copies of Winston's journals, Eleanor's files, and the growing stack of evidence they were assembling against Bradford. Charlie entered the room, carrying coffee and a newspaper. "You made the front page again," he announced, tossing the paper onto the bed beside Thomas. The headline read, "Racing Commission expands investigation into Blackwell thoroughbreds." Beneath it was a photo of Bradford leaving the commission offices, his expression thunderous. "Bradford's losing ground," Charlie observed, settling into the room's only armchair. "Public opinion is shifting. People are starting to ask questions about why a man like you, with your reputation, would risk everything over a supposedly mediocre horse." Thomas nodded absently, his attention focused on the laptop screen before him. Eleanor had provided access to the Blackwell Thoroughbreds security archive, a password-protected system that Bradford had apparently forgotten existed. Thomas had spent the past 3 days methodically reviewing footage from the weeks leading up to Spirit's accident. "Found anything useful?" Charlie asked, noting his friend's intense concentration. "Maybe," Thomas replied, pausing the video. "Look at this." Charlie moved to peer over Thomas's shoulder. The grainy nighttime footage showed the Blackwell training area. A figure moved purposefully toward the tack room, glancing furtively over his shoulder before entering. "Bradford?" Charlie guessed. Thomas nodded. "This is 2 days before Spirit's accident. Watch what happens next." The footage continued, showing Bradford emerging from the tack room carrying what appeared to be a saddle, Spirit's saddle, based on the distinctive marking visible even in the low-quality video. He carried it to another room, one not covered by the cameras. He returned it 30 minutes later, Thomas explained, fast-forwarding to show Bradford replacing the saddle. Juan Reyes reported concerns about the tack feeling off during training the next day, but no one could find anything obviously wrong. "Subtle sabotage," Charlie said grimly. "Something that wouldn't be immediately visible but would fail under stress." "Exactly." Thomas closed the laptop. "This could be the smoking gun, Charlie. Evidence that Bradford deliberately compromised Spirit's equipment before the race where he was injured." A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Jessie entered, looking energized despite the long hours she had been putting in, helping Thomas navigate the racing industry's complex politics. "I found Juan Reyes," she announced triumphantly. "He's working as a training jockey in Florida now. I spoke with him this morning, and he's willing to testify about his concerns regarding Spirit's equipment before the accident." Thomas felt a surge of hope. "That's excellent news. With Juan's testimony and this security footage, we can establish a pattern of deliberate sabotage." "There's more," Jessie continued, her expression growing more serious. "Eleanor called. Winston's condition has deteriorated significantly. The doctors are saying it's a matter of days, perhaps hours." Thomas's momentary elation faded. Despite their progress with the investigation, the knowledge that Winston might not live to see justice served weighed heavily on him. "He's asking for you," Jessie added gently. "Eleanor says he has something important to tell you before." She left the sentence unfinished. Thomas nodded, understanding the urgency. "I'll go immediately. Charlie, can you continue reviewing the footage? Look for any other instances of Bradford near Spirit's equipment." "Of course," Charlie agreed. "Jessie and I will hold down the fort here." The Blackwell estate looked different in the soft glow of evening, less imposing somehow, as if the mansion itself sensed the approaching end of an era. A private nurse admitted Thomas without question, leading him through hushed corridors to Winston's suite in the East Wing. Eleanor sat beside her husband's bed, her silver hair gleaming in the subdued lighting. Winston lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest, his once powerful frame now appearing childlike beneath the bed covers. "Thomas," Eleanor greeted him with quiet dignity. "Thank you for coming so quickly. Winston has been asking for you." She rose, surrendering her place beside the bed. Thomas sat down, taking Winston's frail hand in his own. The older man's eyes fluttered open, recognition dawning slowly. "Thomas," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You came." "Of course, sir. How are you feeling?" A ghost of a smile crossed Winston's pale lips. "Dying, but at peace now, thanks to you." He paused, gathering strength. "Spirit, is he safe?" "Yes," Thomas assured him. "The commission has him under protection. Bradford can't reach him." Winston nodded slightly, relieved. "Good. There's something..." You need to know." He gestured weakly toward a bedside drawer. "Eleanor, please." Eleanor opened the drawer and withdrew a small leather case, which she handed to Thomas. Inside was a USB drive, unmarked except for a small W etched into its surface. "Insurance," Winston explained, each word a visible effort. "I knew. Bradford was working against me. Didn't know how far he'd go. Recorded everything, conversations, plans." His breathing became more labored. "After Spirit. Suspected something terrible. Too late to stop him. But not too late. For justice." Thomas clutched the drive, understanding its significance. "You've been gathering evidence against your own son all this time?" Winston's eyes filled with tears. "Hardest thing a father can do, but necessary. Bradford lost his way. Money, power, forgot what matters." Eleanor placed a comforting hand on her husband's shoulder. Winston tried to guide him, to teach him that our legacy isn't measured in dollars but in the horses we breed, the beauty and excellence we contribute to the racing world. Bradford never understood. "He'll be exposed now," Thomas promised. "With this evidence, and what we've already gathered, the commission will have no choice but to act." Winston seemed to relax slightly at these words. "One more thing," he murmured. "Spirit. When this is over, take him home. Your home. Train him again. Not for racing, too late for that. But he deserves to run free, to be a horse again." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I promise, Winston. Spirit will have the life he deserves." A peaceful expression settled over Winston's features. "Good. That's good." His eyes drifted closed, the conversation having depleted his limited reserves of energy. Eleanor touched Thomas's shoulder gently. "He may sleep for a while now. The medication helps with the pain, but makes him drowsy." They moved to a sitting area across the room, speaking in hushed tones to avoid disturbing Winston. "Bradford knows he's losing control of the narrative," Eleanor said, pouring tea from a silver service. "He's becoming desperate, unpredictable. Be careful, Thomas. My son has resources and connections that go beyond the racing world." "I'm being cautious," Thomas assured her. "The hotel has security, and we're not discussing sensitive information over phones or email." Eleanor nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "It may not be enough. Bradford has always been ruthless in pursuing what he wants. Now that his reputation and position are threatened, I fear what he might do." As if summoned by their conversation, the bedroom door opened, and Bradford Blackwell himself entered. He stopped short at the sight of Thomas, his face hardening into a mask of contempt. "What is he doing here?" Bradford demanded, addressing his mother while glaring at Thomas. "Your father asked to see him," Eleanor replied calmly. "This is still Winston's house, Bradford. He decides who visits his bedside." Bradford's gaze dropped to the USB drive in Thomas's hand, and a flicker of recognition and fear crossed his face. "What is that? What has he given you?" Thomas pocketed the drive without responding, maintaining a steady gaze on Bradford. The younger Blackwell took a step forward, his posture threatening, but stopped when a soft voice called from the bed. "Bradford." Winston had awakened, his voice weak but commanding attention. "Enough." Bradford hesitated, then moved to his father's bedside, deliberately turning his back on Thomas and Eleanor. "Father, you should be resting. These disturbances aren't good for your health." Winston regarded his son with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "Too late to worry about my health, Bradford. But not too late for truth." "What truth?" Bradford's voice held a note of desperation now. "These wild accusations about Spirit, a horse that died years ago? Father, you're being manipulated by people who want to destroy everything we've built." "Not we," Winston corrected softly. "What I built, what you tried to dismantle." He closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength. "I know what you did to Spirit. The sabotage, the cover-up, all of it." Bradford's shoulders stiffened. You're confused. The medication. Stop. Winston's command was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of authority. No more lies. Not here. Not now. A tense silence filled the room. Bradford remained motionless, his back to Thomas and Eleanor, his head bowed over his father's bed. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold, controlled. You were always blinded by sentiment, father, treating horses like they were family members instead of business assets. That's why the company was stagnating under your leadership. Winston shook his head slightly. Not stagnating, growing responsibly, building legacy, not just profit. Legacy? Bradford scoffed. What good is legacy in today's market? While you were breeding for some mystical ideal of the perfect horse, our competitors were diversifying, expanding globally. I did what was necessary to keep Blackwell competitive. By sabotaging Spirit, Thomas interjected, unable to remain silent any longer. By risking a horse's life, and his jockey's, for financial gain. Bradford turned slowly, his expression glacial. You have no idea what you're talking about, old man. You're a relic, just like my father's outdated breeding philosophies. We have the security footage, Thomas said quietly. We have Juan Reyes's testimony about the equipment issues. And now, he patted his pocket where the USB drive rested. We have whatever evidence your father has been gathering against you all these years. For a moment, genuine fear flashed across Bradford's features before he regained his composure. Circumstantial, hearsay, the ramblings of a dying man and the desperate accusations of a washed-up trainer. It won't stand up to serious scrutiny. The Racing Commission disagrees, Thomas countered. Their investigation is expanding daily. More witnesses are coming forward. People who suspected something was wrong but were afraid to speak up against the Blackwell name. The truth is coming out, Bradford. It's only a matter of time. Bradford's expression hardened into something dangerous. We'll see about that. He turned back to his father. Rest well, father. I'll handle this situation, as I've handled everything else while you've been indisposed. With that parting shot, he strode from the room, the door closing firmly behind him. Eleanor released a shaky breath. You should leave immediately, Thomas. Take the back stairs. I don't trust Bradford not to try something rash. Thomas nodded, understanding the urgency. He returned to Winston's bedside for a final farewell. The older man was fading visibly, the confrontation with his son having drained his remaining energy. Thank you, Winston murmured, his eyes already closing. For Spirit, for truth. Rest easy, Thomas replied softly. I'll make sure your legacy is preserved. Following Eleanor's directions, Thomas departed through the service entrance, avoiding the main areas of the house where he might encounter Bradford. The USB drive felt heavy in his pocket, laden with the weight of its potential revelations. As he drove back to Lexington, Thomas's mind raced with possibilities. The evidence they had assembled, combined with whatever was on Winston's drive, might be enough to not only secure Spirit's future, but also to expose Bradford's corruption and protect Winston's true legacy. 3 days later, Winston Blackwell passed peacefully in his sleep. The racing world mourned the loss of a legend, eulogies pouring in from across the globe celebrating his contributions to thoroughbred breeding and his unwavering commitment to excellence. On the same day, the Kentucky Racing Commission announced the preliminary findings of their investigation. Spirit, the promising thoroughbred believed euthanized 7 years earlier, was indeed alive. DNA testing had confirmed his identity beyond doubt. Falsified euthanasia documents had been uncovered, along with evidence suggesting deliberate equipment tampering prior to Spirit's career-ending injury. Bradford Blackwell was suspended from all racing activities pending the completion of the investigation, and control of Blackwell Thoroughbreds temporarily transferred to a management committee headed by Eleanor Blackwell. 1 week after Winston's funeral, Thomas stood in the morning sunlight at his modest farm, watching as Spirit explored his new paddock. The horse moved with increasing confidence, his rehabilitation progressing steadily under Thomas and Charlie's careful supervision. The old injury would always affect his gait somewhat, but his spirit, the quality that had given him his name, remained unbroken. "He looks happy," Jesse observed, joining Thomas at the fence. "Like he knows he's home." Thomas nodded, a bittersweet smile crossing his weathered face. Winston would be pleased. This is what he wanted, for Spirit to live the life he was meant to have, not hidden away as a living secret. Charlie approached from the barn, holding a newspaper. "The commission's full report is out," he announced. "Bradford's finished in the racing world. Criminal charges are being considered for the fraud, though they're still investigating whether they can prove intent in the equipment tampering." Thomas took the paper, scanning the headlines without really reading them. The details hardly mattered now. What mattered was that Spirit was safe, Winston's legacy preserved, and the truth revealed. "What will you do now?" Jesse asked. "Eleanor mentioned that she'd like you to consult on rebuilding the Blackwell breeding program." Thomas shook his head. "I'm too old for that kind of commitment." Besides, he gestured toward Spirit, who had approached the fence and was nudging Thomas's shoulder affectionately. "I have other priorities now." In the distance, a car appeared on the gravel driveway, Eleanor Blackwell's elegant sedan. She had been a frequent visitor since Winston's passing, finding comfort in seeing Spirit thriving in his new home. "One chapter ends, another begins," Thomas murmured, reaching up to stroke Spirit's neck. The horse nickered softly in response, his intelligent eyes reflecting the morning sun. Free at last, his true identity restored, his future secure in the hands of the man who had never stopped believing in him. In the end, Thomas reflected, that's what mattered most in life. Not wealth or status or power, but truth, justice, and the courage to fight for both, even against seemingly insurmountable odds. Spirit had been worth the fight. Winston's legacy had been worth the fight. And though the battle had come late in Thomas's life, it had reminded him of a fundamental truth, that some bonds, between human and horse, between mentor and protege, between truth and justice, transcend time, deception, and even death itself. As Eleanor approached, her dignified figure silhouetted against the Kentucky landscape that the Blackwell family had helped shape for generations, Thomas felt a profound sense of completion. Whatever challenges lay ahead for the Blackwell legacy, for Spirit or for himself, this moment, this vindication, would sustain him through them all. Spirit tossed his head and broke into a spontaneous trot along the fence line, his movement fluid despite the old injury, his joy in simple freedom evident in every stride. Thomas watched him with a heart full of gratitude and peace, knowing that sometimes, against all odds, justice prevails, truth emerges, and second chances become possible, even for an old man and a horse that the world had once left behind.